Hey, listeners, it's me, your host, Alexis Pedrick. While diving into the colorful history of, well, color therapy, we stumbled upon a curious history surrounding the color pink. From class and gender norms entwined with the hue, all the way to twisted prison experiments. Our associate producer, Sarah Kaplan, sat down with Dr. Dominique Grisard to talk more about the color's history. Grisard is a professor of gender studies at the University of Basel and is currently working on a research project related to the history of femininity, sexuality, and whiteness through and around the color pink.
Is there like a certain idea around the color pink that maybe culturally we kind of share?
Absolutely. I mean, in times of globalization, I think the most common connection to pink is, femininity,
Mhm.
and mostly a white kind of dainty femininity, but yeah, more generally femininity. And I think there can be variation, cultural variation and also contextual variation. I think it's important to pay attention to that. But there's definitely this shared understanding of pink as feminine. And I think that was my main question is like, why does pink have a gender
Mhm.
when other colors do not, or not as strongly? This connection is particularly strong when it comes to pink, and you will not find the same connection with other colors.
Can you talk a bit more about that history, that kind of like gendered history? Has it always been the way we kind of think of pink?
No, I mean, and I think that was also something that got me excited is that historically you can show that it's actually kind of a short history, especially for historians, who think in longer terms, and that pink might have not always been connected to gender, but maybe to class. And that's, when I start my history is in the 18th century, when pink and bright colors more generally were the domain of the aristocracy. And this is now speaking, from a European perspective, sort of looking at Europe at the time, at the social order of that time, and seeing how then bright colors and fashion was the domain of sort of the nobility and all the people living at court. And there was one particular person, Madame de Pompadour. She was the mistress of Louis the 15th. We're talking about the 18th century here. She was very influential. She became actually quite powerful as a mistress and more as a politician, sort of informally, because formally she wasn't able to hold, high offices, but she got her relatives into, the important places, and she exerted influence through her lover, Louis the King of the time, Louis the 15th. So she loved pink and she was, dressed in pink. So afterwards, when there was a regime change and the French Revolution and the middle class ascended, so the bourgeoisie, and they're like, we do not want the excesses of the nobility, of the aristocracy. We want a society that is built on equality and freedom. So with these ideals of the French Revolution, pink came to stand for all the excessive ways and irrational ways of exerting power of the previous regime of the aristocracy and the monarchy. So it wasn't really associated with gender or femininity that much, even though it was this woman, this mistress
Mhm.
who epitomized pink, but it was more associated with sort of a different class, this upper class. So first it was more bright colors more generally, and fashion. It was important to men at the time, to bourgeois men, middle class men, but they were supposed to dress in dark colors and subdued colors because that would, sort of distinguish them from the aristocracy. But it was important for them to show that they were in power. And that's what they did through their wives and children. So they dressed them in bright colors, in expensive fabrics, in, fashionable clothing. And to show, oh, my wife and my children, they do not need to work. Look, their dresses are pristine, they're bright colors. They can also afford to buy new clothing when the colors fade, because at the time, colors did fade much more readily than they would today, even though they didn't wash them as much as we do today. But it is the time, of this 19th century then, when you would have also industrial dye stuffs made, which would eventually become more affordable.
Are there other cultural moments that are kind of intertwined with pink?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think sort of this very early stuff, a lot of it is very indirect, and, one discerns that this must be how, pink became what we know today. But sort of if we just look at the 20th century, there are a lot of cultural moments. A lot of them are connected to the US history, because it's sort of, I think, an important cultural moment is probably the 1950s and consumer culture becoming much more dominant, Hollywood becoming very visible, and Europe sort of being, grappling, after World War II and being more occupied with other stuff. So the US was really sort of where everybody looked to what to consume, how to consume, and this sheer wealth of the middle classes. Of course, there are white middle classes mostly, and also a model family or social order that became very visible through film, through advertisements at the time. Sort of the 1950s ads of the woman in the kitchen, and the kitchen was actually made out of pink formica and matching basically the apron of the housewife, who was just so fulfilled. I mean, ostensibly, right? By just being at home and baking a cake for the husband who would come home after a strenuous day at work. And sort of the ideals, these norms that were produced at the time and produced in advertisements and in film are definitely very important. Also, the first lady at the time, Mammy Eisenhower, and she was also sort of a proponent of the color pink. She loved it, I guess. And there was this saying that she had decorated the White House, or at least the private chambers, in a lot of pink tones. So she kind of stood, or was the role model for this pink lifestyle of a femininity that was seen to be quite youngish, girly-ish, very much into consuming, and also consuming industrial clothing. So not clothing that was made at home, made by the housewife herself, but was actually bought at a department store. But a femininity that was happy to stay home and be sort of the protector of the home and of the emotions, of all these quite stereotypical things. And who was happy to be also the ornament on the arm of her husband, sort of what one would call arm candy nowadays. So that is definitely also an important moment in sort of the strong connection between femininity and pink.
Would you say that kind of time period, that shaping of pink through film and public figures, is that more or less kind of the association we still have with pink?
It's changed a little bit. It's become definitely more about beautification and less about being the perfect housewife and cooking and sewing and taking care of children. So it's much more about appearance and taking care of oneself and, yeah, sort of taking advantage of the pink economy and buying into the pink economy of sort of being attractive, beautiful, or at least pretty in pink, be it, for sort of their partner, one's partner, or in the workplace. So I think that is sort of a trend that we see. And, an important cultural moment definitely is also Disney and Disney princess. So not just Disney more general, because Disney princesses early on weren't necessarily pink, but sort of, come the 1990s and later, you would have this pinkification of Disney princess and, the Disney princess line being created. So that's definitely also an important cultural moment. And of course, Disney in that sense, or Disney princess, also shaped the way we understand pink
Mhm.
So it's become even more girlish or even younger of a color and more tied to beautification.
What do you think about all the things with Barbie recently in pink? What do you think like all the love with pink currently is about?
It's a super good question. I'm actually teaching a seminar on Barbie, believe it or
Mhm.
not, and looking at how Barbie as a cultural phenomenon changed over the years since its existence in the 1950s. And, early on, feminism really grappled with Barbie in a very critical and negative way. And Barbie was basically demonized for many things
Mhm.
and also unrealistic body proportions and body norms and beauty norms. And that definitely changed with the Barbie film. And there's been a sort of mainstreaming of a pop feminism that is very strongly tied to this type of Barbie, the Barbie film.
Mhm.
And pink, maybe even earlier though, with so-called pussy hat feminism, pink
Mhm.
has become a very feminist color, but tied to a very popular mainstream kind of feminism
Mhm.
that still very much embraces consumer culture, is not very critical of consumerism, and embraces femininity, also stereotypical femininity, but sometimes also, especially also in the Barbie film, with a lot of irony and a lot of humor tied to it. So there's a lot of knowledge there about the pitfalls of stereotypical femininity. So in some sense, it's very smart.
Mhm.
But I think it's definitely not critical or not very critical of capitalism,
Mhm. Yeah.
but feminist nonetheless. So very important also in depicting pink as a strong color, as one that one can use to push women's and equality issues more generally.
Can you briefly summarize the studies first conducted with Baker Miller Pink by Alexander Schoss?
Yeah, so he started this research, these studies in the 70s, and published a few, research papers on what he termed Baker Miller pink. I think the first one was in 79, and then in the 80s, he published some more. The early ones pushed this notion that pink actually used in prisons. And later on, I think he conducted also experiments in locker rooms, so connected to sports. But the first studies were in prisons, and I think concerning mostly male prisoners. And there he tried to prove that pink, or his particular tone of pink, this Baker Miller pink, soothes the mind and decreases muscular strength. And that's how then it became urban legend. It would weaken strong men, or these men, these hypermasculine men seem to be the ones who end in prison. So there's been a numerous research after that. And even I think his own research, from what I know, has then disproven what he tried to prove, or he had different results in his research that didn't really show long term effects of the color. So he could show, at least in the early experiments, sort of short term or surprise effects of when the men were exposed to pink or this particular shade of pink, that they would sort of show a soothed mind, whatever that is exactly, and decreased muscular strength. But it wasn't anything that, was more sustainable. And I think what they show, these experiments, is more how pervasive gender stereotypes are and how important it seems to emasculate men. And I think that's where maybe Pink in prison was quite powerful, in the sense that you have this prison population, male prison population, with a specific gender order in prison. Of course, it's a space, a homosocial space with only men present. And as we know, and it's also, stereotypical knowledge that we know also through film and TV, that within prison, there's also a gender order, even though there is no women present, you would have, sort of so-called penetrators and the penetrated. So not only a sort of a misogyny reigning prison, but also homophobia sort of creating the hierarchies within prison. And of course, in that kind of setting, then pink might develop power and an effect because pink is so strongly associated with femininity and by association also with homosexuality, given also the history of homosexuality also being closely related to femininity. Also because of sexual practices, but also because of early understandings of homosexuality, where one thought homosexuality was some kind of a gender inversion. So it was kind of like being feminine and the woman in the equation. So due to several historical developments, there is this close association between homosexuality and femininity that then plays out in prison in a particular way. And of course, in that setting, using pink might develop a certain color effect, but it's probably less about the physiological, or the physiological is definitely tied to symbols and to gender norms and sexual norms, tied to who's active and who's passive in the relationship, who's being penetrated and who's the penetrator, who's deemed masculine and who's deemed feminine and weak in that by association.
Do you think these studies, just like the designs were flawed? Like, do you think they should have maybe tested multiple colors or tested like multiple populations? Do you think like there could have been anything maybe that would have helped the studies prove something?
Well, I'm not a scientist, I'm a humanities person, but there have been studies, research done in the 21st century showing in the sciences, showing that there have been these studies by Shaw's were flawed and that there was a lot of bias, especially gender bias, that informed the studies. And I would say that's definitely the case. Mm-hmm. So there's a study, I think, in 2014 that was conducted that showed, that there is definitely gender bias, especially also because they often concentrated on the male prison population. They didn't take enough into account or didn't name the social construction of certain colors. And so you can see there's a lot of bias at work informing the studies, but also there's a lot of gender bias at work in the prison and in this, homosocial world of the prison, or also in sports. The idea of painting a locker room pink, the locker room of the opponent's team pink, to make sure that they lose the game, is informed by notions of course, ideas around, sports and the masculinity of sports and the femininity of this particular color. That if you maybe contextualize it and historicize it, there is some truth to it, but it is, it's tied to this very specific European history or Euro-American history of color, where Black is deemed the more reputable, the rational color, or a non-color, invisible, but definitely, tied to rationality, to seriosity, to many things that are sort of tied to masculinity and professionalism and bright colors, and especially pink, tied to the frivolous world of women and children.
The studies were from 40 plus years ago. I know I've come across like articles recently about like using pink in your household and like painting walls certain colors. Why do you think we kind of still hold on to the idea that pink does something when we look at it?
Yeah, I think it's a multiple factors that produce this myth or urban legend and keep it alive. And I think there's definitely, money involved. So there's a financial interest in selling, this myth of pink is for girls and blue is for boys. And there is also an interest by, for example, institutions like hospitals or prisons to keep also costs low. So using pink in prison, painting walls pink as they do in certain Swiss prisons now, is quite cost effective. So it's not as expensive as other therapies would be, or more punitive ways of enacting a prison regime. So that is one aspect. I think there's definitely something around money and financial gains or financial saving expenditures. But sort of looking at maybe children's consumer culture or sort of how pink and other colors produce gender stereotypes and a very specific, gender binary of, as I said, blue is for boys, pink is for girls. I think there's a lot of interest also by people. So individuals, parents, of keeping it the way it supposedly has always been, which of course isn't true. If you look at it historically, there's been actually a lot of gender variation and a lot of changes happening within gender regimes, and it hasn't always been so clear cut. But there is this myth that it's always been the way one believes the 1950s have been. So there's a lot of interest by people in producing that. So they celebrate gender reveal parties and code them in pink or in blue. They celebrate baby showers. They paint the nursery in a certain color that supposedly then means this child will develop or is already a boy or a girl. So I think there's a real desire in the gender binary and making sure we know girls are still girls and they love pink and they love princess stuff. And it sort of is a generational thing also. A lot of parents look back at their childhood and then they think, oh, I was allowed to play pink princess stuff. So I want this to be possible for my girl. And I want my girl to be like me. And I mean, it's very complicated, the way also nostalgia and the construction of also nostalgia, or sort of the way it has always been, plays into certain colors being so overladen with gender stereotypes. So there is a lot of still policing around colors and policing the gender boundaries still at play in childhood. But for sure, there's also much more acceptance and variety also. So that makes one hopeful. And, also looking at history and seeing how things change all the time.
Distillations is produced by the Science History Institute. Our executive producer is Mariel Carr. Our producer is Rigoberto Hernandez. And our associate producer is Sarah Kaplan. This episode was reported by Sarah Kaplan and mixed by Jonathan Pfeffer, who also composed our theme music. This episode was inspired by our museum exhibit, Bold, Color from Test Tube to Textile. You can learn more at sciencehistory.org/bold. You can find all our podcasts as well as videos and articles at sciencehistory.org/stories. And you can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news about our podcast and everything else going on in our free museum and library. For Distillations, I'm Alexis Pedrick. Thanks for listening.